also recognized the interconnectedness of these three areas and absolutely wanted to continue to work together in solving them. This is something that the presenters will highlight the importance of as well. The Climate Change Conference happens annually, while the Biodiversity and Desertification conferences happen biannually. This year, all three conferences took place, beginning with the 16th Biodiversity Conference held in Cali, Colombia in October, followed by the 29th Conference to Address Climate Change held in Baku, Azerbaijan in November, and just yesterday, the 16th Conference to Combat Desertification began in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Today, we are joined by Maryknoll sisters Margaret Laxon and Dee Smith, along with Lisa Sullivan, the Senior Program Officer of Integral Ecology at Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns. Each will highlight their takeaways from these conferences. I'm Sarah Keno. I'm a current climate justice intern at Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, and I'll be discussing a little bit my experience as a COP29 virtual attendee. If at any point you have questions, you are invited to submit them using the Q&A chat box that is at the bottom of your screen. Should be a little bar and an icon indicating where you can tap that and write those in. And we'll have a time to answer all those questions at the very end of the webinar. So for myself personally, while virtually attending COP29, which is the UN Climate Summit that occurred in November, I was able to participate in side events detailing a broad range of issue areas. Those highlighting the importance of dialogue with Indigenous peoples were personally most compelling. This is a subject that our other presenters will also touch on. In one specific dialogue between Indigenous peoples and board members of the Fund for Responding to Loss, one of the panelists came to his final remarks, stopped, and said, "I would like someone from the audience to share their final remarks on my behalf." He emphasized in this that our connectedness and common voice for climate equity means that everyone in the room should have a chance to speak. Just because he is on a pedestal does not mean his words have any more value than anyone else. And so on his behalf, an Indigenous woman from Guatemala stood up in the back of the room and delivered the final address in Spanish. It was very impactful to see empowerment in action in a space where it's often easy for many to use their power negatively. I came away from many of these talks reflecting on my tendency towards pessimism. The state of climate finance appears bleak, and even when something gets done, its efficacy is questionable at best as developed countries work to retain power. Yet, I believe it takes courage to be among the hopeful, the optimists not because they're blind or ignorant, but because they see the powerful rings of work done well by all the important people on the ground. Their voices may not be the loudest, but the goodness of their accomplishments ripples much farther than we can see. The networks that come from coalitions of affected people banding together are power, and we can all work to create space for their power to be recognized. So with that, I'd like to hand the floor to Lisa Sullivan, Senior Program Officer for Integral Ecology, to tell us a little bit more about the UN Climate Summit that occurred.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Your words are so inspiring, as it is inspiring to work with you. So delighted to take it over here. And if you could put up the next photo, there we go. We're going to begin in kind of reverse order. I'm going to speak to the most recent convention, which was COP27, the Climate Change Convention, which was held in Baku, Azerbaijan. It's called COP, which means Conference of the Parties, which means the countries that are parties or signatories to the UN framework on climate change. And 29, because this is the 29th round, this is the 29th year that this has happened. It's also the third year in a row in which the venue for this conference is in a fossil fuel or a petrostate, fossil fuel producing country. So that's something that's really framed the results of the past couple years. Next slide, please. Each COP addresses so many different issues, but the hope is that there'll be at least some concrete takeaways that will help guide actions throughout the world. And so just want to share that the previous COP was COP28 that took place in Dubai in the UAE. And there were at least three takeaways from that COP. One was operationalizing what's called the Loss and Damage Fund. That's a fund to assist communities who are already been affected by climate change. Another commitment that came out of this COP was the commitment to triple renewable energy. And the last one, which is a last minute decision, but extremely important, was the decision to call for a transition away from fossil fuels. It took 28 COPs to name the elephant in the room, but it happened. Next slide. So for COP29, we arrived at COP29. That's Margaret and I there below, raising our hands in victory. That's our first day. You can tell the looks on their face. We came with a lot of enthusiasm in spite of a day and a half plane ride and 9-hour time difference. But we arrived with a lot of enthusiasm, as did many people, I hope. To COP, there are many participants, 198 countries participate. This was the second biggest COP with 55,000 participants, including 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists, also negotiators from the different countries, civil society, politicians, scientists, and there were 4 of us representing Maryknoll. It was Margaret representing the Maryknoll Sisters, and I was there on behalf of the Maryknoll Society, Fathers and Brothers. And we also asked for extra credentials. It's very hard to get credentials, actually, to these events. And so we felt it was important to share those credentials with those who are climate activists from the countries that are most in climate vulnerable places around the globe. And so we were delighted to share a badge with Yolanda up there at the left, who is from Mozambique with a rural women's community there working with climate issues. And to the right, Chinta from India with a youth climate organization. So they shared, together we shared representation of Maryknoll. Next. You know, why are we there? That's the question we sometimes get asked. And the reason why we're there is because where Maryknoll is present around the world, we are present in many of the areas that are being walloped by climate change. We are present in many of the most climate vulnerable countries. We see the results. But we're also present because many of these places, their initiatives, local initiatives, they're doing precisely what the world needs to do to address this issue. And so we bring with us that spirit, that innovation and that that spark from many of the communities around the world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where we're present. So here just are a couple of examples. To the left, a tree planting initiative in Kenya. The Maryknoll Fathers have started. Top right, 2 Maryknoll sisters, Melinda and Joji in Panama, who have helped rewild 50 hectares in the Panama-Darien area. And then to the bottom right, lay missioner Peg Vamosi, who has done so much to support agroecology, a really important initiative in the face of agro industry that's caused a lot of climate difficulties. Next slide. So as soon as we arrived, it was just a few days after US elections, and really a shadow kind of was cast because of those elections and because of a commitment made by President-elect Trump, who indicated that he will most likely pull out of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is part of this, the COP. It's the most recent agreement in which countries agreed to do all they can to keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. And so in the face of his pullout, that obviously cast a shadow, where the US is the highest emitter, the highest cause of climate change, historic emitter. And so that obviously had an effect. A few days later, the delegation from Argentina left. It was guessed that perhaps that was to please President Trump. Can't be approved, but in the fear that other delegations would leave, that proved not to be true. Everybody else buckled down and kept on. Next slide. So next I'm going to address what were the expectations of this particular COP. Next slide. By far, the main expectation was finance. This was the COP in which a new financial goal had to be met. For the past 15 years, there'd been a commitment among the developed countries, the highest emitting greenhouse gas emitting countries, to contribute funds to developing countries in their efforts to both transition and adapt to climate change, acknowledging that they have been the main cause of this problem. So there had been a finance goal which was $100 billion a year which sounds like a lot, but actually the world spends about $100 billion a year on ice cream. And so not only is this goal running out, its time has come up, but there's a need for far greater finance to achieve the transition that's necessary. And so the main goal of this COP was to define what's called the new collective quantified goal, or in other words, how much money would be committed to climate transition. Next page. Next slide. The second main expectation was that there'd be new climate action plans. Those climate action plans per country are called NDCs, which means nationally determined contributions. And because recently at the last COP, a global stock take took place in kind of measuring how on track or not are we as a globe to keeping climate rise, temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we're not doing a good job. And so this new round of climate plans, which is due in early 2025, has to be much stronger to try to keep us on track. And so one of the hopes of this COP was that at least the high emitting countries would submit their plans kind of to spark others to do the same. So that was another expectation. Next slide. And the third main expectation was the follow-up to the big COP28 goal, outcome, transition from fossil fuels, that this COP would make it kind of specific. What does that mean? How are we going to weave that into our commitments? And so there was that hope. Next slide. So off COP begins. It's the last, starting November 11th for 2 weeks. And a lot is happening simultaneously. On one hand, a lot of the press, the world is paying attention to the negotiations. That's the time when the 198 countries sit down together, debate many, many different subjects. A lot of attention is put to those negotiations. But at the same time, there is so much happening simultaneously. Each hour, there's dozens of events. There are side events. There's things happening in different country pavilions. There are meetings taking places. And so in all of these other events, an incredible amount of global connecting is happening. And the people who are doing this global connecting bring with them amazing experiences from the base, from India, from China, from wherever, from Latin America, from Asia. And they're coming from communities, from initiatives that are already taking giant steps. And so those connections are really powerful. And often, as Sarah said, it's those connections that actually spark the decisions. We saw that happen. The decision for loss and damage, some decisions out of the recent biodiversity COP came precisely because of the sparks that happen on the sidelines. Next slide. So one of the events that I said takes place throughout the time are side events. And side events are an incredible opportunity to share ideas and sparks and innovations. And in order to sponsor side events, you must partner with many organizations. And so both the Maryknoll Sisters and Maryknoll Fathers each sponsored different side events. And it was a great opportunity to offer up those innovative solutions. To the left, you see Sister Margaret with a friend from an island, Tuvalu, who has worked in adaptation plans. It's an island that's being swept away or going to be swallowed up by the sea if things continue. And so what they're actually doing at the ground is something that really the world needs to pay attention to. And so she shared a panel with other local adaptation experts from Hindu and Buddhists and Muslim and et cetera, different initiatives. So just an example of how we can share what's happening again at the grassroots and raise that up through side events. Next slide. Meanwhile, the negotiations were happening, clock was ticking, nothing was coming out. We were worrying, everybody was worried. It looked like the developed countries were sitting on their pile of money while everybody else was waiting. Next slide. So here's the results. Next slide again. So in terms of those climate plans, the NDCs was not quite what people hoped for. We'd hoped that the big countries, the big emitters would come up with their plans. We got at least one big one. The UK turned in a very ambitious plan to reduce their emissions by 81%. Brazil also turned in a pretty good NDC, 67%. But other countries such as the UAE, which had hosted the previous COP, 44% was just not enough to keep on track for 1.5. And the US just was very disappointing that it did not turn in its NDC as was hoped. Next. nor was there any follow-up on just how that transition for fossil fuels will be woven into other actions. Next. And most disappointing is the pot of money. It was pretty much agreed that what the world needs to transition, the amount of money we need to transition to away from a fossil fuel economy is 1.3 trillion. Sounds like a lot of money, but much more money is being given in subsidies to fossil fuel companies. Much more money is being given to wars. And so the money is there. It's just not, the willingness to use it is not there. Next. So what did happen is sometimes compared to an onion, the pot of money being like that onion, in that the commitment that was made at the very last hour at 3 a.m. on Sunday, when everybody was utterly exhausted, the developed countries agreed to commit $300 billion a year to developing countries in public funding. They did not specify how that would be. There was a hope it would just be in terms of grants. But what's left, or what's called the other layers, the hope is that with that foundation, other layers of innovative finance may complete the 1.3 trillion. And some of those layers being debt relief, global finance architecture, revamping, the World Bank, the IMF, how that funding happens, and creating a global wealth tax. So those are other ways that the gaps may be filled. So on one hand, some of the developed countries said, look, isn't this great? We've tripled what we've given. Look, we're finding other ways. But the feeling of the majority of the world was on the faces of those people to the right, a sense that they're of betrayal, that this is not even a fourth of what's really needed to respond to this crisis. Next. So we're going to turn the page. COP30 will be next year, and we'll be in Brazil and the Amazon. I would say that it was one kind of light that kept us going, in the sense that I think there is greater hope for what might happen in Brazil because of policies taking place there regarding climate. Next. And I'll end with this last slide with the bright yellow background, because I'm going to follow Sarah's lead in saying we do have to have hope. And I think there is hope in terms of what we can do individually, given this massive attempt as a globe to try to solve our climate problem. We can contribute in one very specific way in the coming year, 2025. It's a Jubilee year. And there's going to be a really huge concerted effort once again to try to move towards debt forgiveness of sovereign debts. Many countries are so burdened by debt. That is why they are unable to have the finance that they need to transition. And so there's many ways in which individuals can participate in that debt campaign. And then to the right, as you know, action is going to have to take place, at least in the US, on a local level. Probably for the next 4 years, we won't be at this convention as a country. And so there's a statement, America's all in. There's still many efforts at local levels. So we really look forward to hearing from many of you kind of what you're already doing, some amazing initiatives. I know of people who are already here, for example, trying to get the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty signed in their local city, in their town, in their state. And so there's many efforts that will have to continue at a local level. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton to my partner in crime at the two COPs, Sister Margaret Laxon, who's going to take it from here.
Okay, unmute and video. All right, so Lisa has given you an overview of COP29. My part here is just to give a little flavor of the side events and the little stuff there in COP29. So this is the beautiful what was that? The design of COP29. So what I would like to share is the side events that I was able to attend while I was there. And if you notice, I somehow was attracted to those that talk about climate justice, just transition, faith actors, but I was somehow led to the many loss and damage beyond material loss and damage, again, international loss and damage, loss and damage. What is this? Lisa has somehow explained, but this loss and damage are the small developing countries who have contributed very little to the carbon emissions that is causing the climate change. They are asking for remuneration or some kind of money to help them to to um, to adapt to these changes that climate change has brought to their islands, to their small countries. And what surprised me very much was that there were apart from the material loss and damage, the economic loss and damage, I have this. I listened to this beyond material loss. Uh, how do you call that? Yeah, okay. I would like to focus this talk on the beyond the material loss. So I learned from all these side events, what were these non-economic loss and damages? So many times these were the indigenous peoples and island peoples who were talking. And what is it for them? It's their loss of their culture, their language, their identity, their history, their traditions, their traditional knowledge and legacy, when even the plants and the trees that they don't recognize anymore um, when they get displaced. So an example is Vanuatu. That lady that Lisa pictured me with earlier, she's from Vanuatu, and their islands are slowly disappearing because of the rise of the seas. She says if the cyclone came early, and so they lost their crops, and they can't do the rituals anymore that were connected with the crops. So that's just an example of loss of culture. And then, of course, we have loss of lives. I mean, from the climate disasters themselves. But we have also already 2,000 plus land defenders who are murdered. And then they have displacement from their ancestral lands, forced migration that has been mentioned already, and the loss of burial lands. Also from Vanuatu, they were saying the rising of the seas have buried their burial lands underwater. So they cannot do anymore their rituals in their for their ancestors. And then together with this climate change, we have mental health instability, trauma, and climate anxiety especially for the young people. When the next cyclone comes, it's like the children are already afraid of what's going to happen. And one girl from the Philippines gave a testimony that the frequent typhoons disrupt their school holidays. She said, "What does that do to my right to education? My education is disrupted, and my foundation is weakened." And many of them said these losses are irreversible, irreplaceable, and finance, and even they say climate finance is not even the solution, because you can never compensate for these losses of they say market-based solutions are causing further loss and damage and are doing more harm to the indigenous peoples and their homelands. We have an example of this, the Maasai, where they are being displaced from their lands because of conservation policies. So they know that climate finance is not the solution. Many of them are saying that this is not charity. You know, it looks like they are begging the small they were hoping, the small developed countries were hoping for 1.3 trillion as a commitment, but all they got was 300 billion, I think. So it looks like, to me, it looks like they were begging these rich countries, please give us. But actually, many of them were saying, no, this is not charity, it is just justice and solidarity. And many of them recognize the false solutions that are being pressed forward, even there at COP. Yeah, they said instead of this, we should, UNFCCC should be preventing, averting, and minimizing. That should be the action that UNFCCC should be in. Okay, so now I'll move towards a pavilion that I got interested in. This is just a slide to show you the country pavilions that were there, that were very interesting. There were other pavilions too, like Just Transition, Faith Pavilion, and all. And the one that I got interested in was the Ocean Pavilion. Why I got interested in this so much? They gave me so much hope, this Ocean Pavilion. Look at the titles of their side events. Every day they would have 3 to 5 events in their Ocean Pavilion. And I think I spent 2 days there, just staying there, listening to what they had to say. Uh, they were not concentrated on asking for money or what shall we do. They were all on solutions like non-scientific infrastructure in climate relevant ocean observation, the resources and resilience in the search for climate solutions, achieving ocean 30 by 30, that's the biodiversity goal. And they were really more towards looking for what can we do instead of just concentrating. But of course, I think they were being funded. They had funds, they had money, and they had all the scientists. This was Ocean Pavilion was a part of the group here were the scientists, so they were into studying the oceans. And I would like to bring up this one woman. There was a side event, Women Leading the Wave, Innovators in Ocean Science and Climate Action. And she was one of the speakers, and her name is Coral Pasisi from the island of Niue. I have not even heard of this island. But she talks about her island. She said, my island is small, but it's in a big blue continent. And how she talks lovingly about that big blue continent. And why I put her up, because she's one example, as I saw many of people who were not waiting for funds, who were not waiting for the big countries to give them money. They went right ahead and to do their own work of preserving the ocean. So what she did was she set up a trust, a foundation. She said, you monetize the effort to preserve the blue continent. She said, and when you give money to this, she said, it's a recognition that the value that you accrue by sponsoring 1 kilometer of ocean in that space has so much more dividends than you will ever get from a financial system. And what I like about her thing is she's really she's included the growth of the women. She said those resources that are leveraged from that approach go into a trust, an endowment that then provides an assured, predictable level of funding to support Niue's community and ocean conservation and resilience in perpetuity. And that means that we get to raise the next generation of ocean leaders. And with this, she mentions that the fund also goes to the women. And what she says with this, sometimes when you get those big funding, they force you, they give you that big money and they force you to spend that money right away in one instance. But she said this kind of funding supports the community, she says, in perpetuity. I've given here her website, or the website to her place, to her efforts in preserving the blue continent. And on top here is the website of the Ocean Pavilion, where all the talks, all the side events they gave in COP29 you can listen to them once again. This is the website of the Ocean Pavilion. And then next. So then the Ocean Pavilion was also there at Biodiversity Cup in Cali, but I did not discover them there. But I think it's just right. The ocean is 71% of our planet. and is the engine that heats the planet, making it a big factor of climate change. Anyway, what affects the oceans, what affects climate change, affects biodiversity. And we now turn to Biodiversity Cup that took place in Cali, Colombia. For Marinol sisters to get accredited to be able to join in Cali, we had to give we had to say that we were involved in biodiversity work. And so these are the 5 examples that I submitted to the Secretariat. We have the Marinol Ecological Sanctuary in the Philippines, protecting the biodiversity of the region. Marby is working at Miriam College, supervising students' ecological work in communities. The Marinol sisters in Monrovia are transforming their piece of property, trying to go back to natural species and make it ecologically sustainable. In Darien, the Web of Life project by Marinol sisters Melinda Roper and Joji Phoenix has restored 80% of its 50 acres to its natural state, while turning the other 20% into a model for sustainable farming. And the 5th one is Dee Smith work in Guatemala, a small mixed agricultural organic farm which aims to promote an ecologically sound response to the monoculture devastation prevalent in the area. We submitted, there's a Faith for Biodiversity group at COP16, and they asked us for submissions for projects, and we submitted both these and the Web of Life in Darien. And the Web of Life got included in their collection of 50 projects, which they compiled in a book and presented to the head of the COP Biodiversity COP16 as examples of efforts of faith groups doing biodiversity work. So as you can see in this picture, this is the land that is owned by that is worked by Melinda and Joji, and you can see that it is green here, whereas the nearby lands are bare. So that is the and here is Sister D attending a side event at COP16. So now I pass it on to D.
Thank you, Margaret. And already I'm hearing the overlap between COP29 and also COP16. And so I hope that I don't bore you with repeating some of the things that have already been said. So just a little background, our mission and the small 2.5 acre farm adjacent to our hospice facility here in Pachapita is one of promoting and implementing a nature-based approach to agriculture and its benefits to nutrition. We would like to be a model of organic farming for our local community and at the same time provide healthy organic food for our hospital residents' nutrition program. To achieve this, we've established an ongoing alliance with local large-scale farmers who not only donate coffee and macadamia husks and pulps to feed our worm composting project, but also offer a safe and secure place to house our 70 beehives for our honey production. We are in the process of establishing a reforestation area on a 5-acre plot of land on one of the local rubber plantations. It will be a joint local initiative financed by the plantation owner and overseen by our Eco Farm team. So with this experience in mind, I accepted the invitation to attend the COP16 event in Cali, Colombia at the end of October. For me, this was going to be a wonderful opportunity to forge new alliances with grassroots NGOs, listen and learn about technological innovations for data collecting, analysis and action, as well as hearing from the indigenous peoples and the local communities on how their role is vital in protecting nature and in defending their lands against biodiversity loss. I kicked off my education with a side event on pollinators in Latin America and the important role bees and butterflies play in maintaining a healthy environment for agricultural production. The decline in healthy habitats for pollination is something we need to take seriously. We need to promote the gentler side of bees and all they do for us, and not have people thinking all bees do is seek out ourselves to sting us. Millions of bees go about their daily task of caring for their colonies without coming near us. If someone is interested in this topic, then look up the International Pollinator Initiative on the internet. You'll find some wonderful information there. One particular interest for me was a side event on health and nature. It was here where I heard from different Indigenous peoples about the importance of an integrated, holistic approach to the protection of biodiverse regions and how it benefits both people and nature. I also heard the sadness in the voices of the presenters when talking of all they have lost over the years through blatant exploitation of their lands through corporate greed. For many Indigenous people, food is sacred, and when the land is contaminated with nuclear waste, pesticides, and chemicals, the spirit is wounded and the community becomes fractured. Considering this, I was delighted when it was announced that the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, have created a permanent subsidiary body for Indigenous peoples and people of African descent and their communities. This in recognition of the vital importance the voice of Indigenous peoples is in global decision-making on matters of biodiversity and needs to be heard. There was also a lot of talk prior to the conference on digital sequencing information. I have to be honest, I had to read up on this as it was new to me. Basically, it's a way of sharing genetic resources throughout the world in a fair and equitable way. At the conference, after attending a few side events all about DSI, I was happy to hear that a special fund was approved to distribute the benefits of this information sharing. The Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, or CALI Fund as it became known, has been established to monitor and reduce the abuses of companies who use DNA-based products from wild organisms and don't reference or acknowledge the source of these components, often extracted from Indigenous lands without fair and prior consent of the local community. With this new mandate, companies will have to contribute 1% of all their profits or 0.1% of their revenue from DSI products to the fund. This mandate will affect primarily pharmaceutical and extractive industries who often go into Indigenous areas to exploit the resources. Half of these funds, when collected, will go directly to Indigenous peoples and local communities. I also had an opportunity to meet with the Executive Secretary of the CBD, Astrid Schumacher, as part of the Faith for Biodiversity delegation. We met with her for almost an hour. She was very supportive of all faith-based efforts to keep pushing the Peace for Nature agenda and for working diligently in local communities, promoting not only the issue of biodiversity loss, but also the spiritual and ethical aspects of protecting the planet. She commented that she feels there is a need to reclaim the spiritual in all that humans do in protecting the future of the planet, and admitted that the UN seems to be neglecting that area in response to the world crisis. So, a few really positive outcomes from my point of view. However, we still have a long way to go and a lot of work ahead for us. We need to reverse biodiversity loss, not just slow it down. During the negotiations, governments pledged $163 million to the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. This was a boost for nature, but it was less than what was hoped for. The total contributions to the fund were roughly $400 million, which falls short by a long way from the 30 billion target by 2030. We must be aware also that the developed countries' governments were pushing more and more for private sector investment, which, as we know, can be a disaster for developing countries, throwing them even deeper into debt. Another noted shortcoming was the failure of many countries to submit their new national biodiversity strategy and action plans. Only 44 of the 192 member countries have compiled with the request to update these plans. These national plans, agreed as part of the Kunming-Montreal Global Diversity Framework, help those of us who are part of civil society to monitor what our governments are doing. I also noted in informal and formal conversations at the side events that many delegates and observers see an artificial divide between biodiversity loss and climate change. Different COPs and separate negotiated approaches add to the problem. In reality, these two crises are inextricably linked. After I packed my bags to return to Guatemala, I reflected on what I had learned during my time in Colombia. Firstly, we have to recognize that nature risk is both global and local. We can all do our bit locally, while at the same time pressuring for change and commitment at the global level. We need to join together more in worthwhile alliances. As deforestation worsens the climate change crisis and kills off plant and animal diversity, we need to push local authorities in actions for regenerating lands and rebuilding forests. There is a notable shift away from the do no harm concept of reducing agrochemical use, reducing deforestation, etc., towards net positive strategies such as biodiversity and ecosystems restoration. It is no longer enough to avoid harming nature. We have to restore the land and its environment. We can continue to nurture our plants at home, but also educate our neighbours and friends to reclaim more small areas and go green there. Unfortunately, the corporate world lacks basic understanding of the ethical and moral imperative to reverse biodiversity loss. They make decisions based on financial markers, and this hinders nature-positive growth. No matter where we are or how we contribute, it will all add up to a positive outcome eventually. And so, with my team here in Pajapita, we will continue to promote healthy soils, care for our land, the production of organic fruits and vegetables, as well as singing the praises of our bees and the gift of their 100% pure honey. And as I suggested to the group before we started this webinar, it came to me also that I know in the USA, in schools you have the 4-H clubs, and I think maybe it's time to start looking around and setting up the 3 C's clubs in schools: care, compassion, and commitment to the land. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all, Lisa, Margaret, and Dee. It was really wonderful what you presented to us today, and your insights were very powerful. We're going to move at this point into the Q&A session. So any questions any of the attendants might have at this point, please just go ahead and write those in the chat box, and we'll receive those on the side. One question that arose is along the lines of some of the struggles that we've seen with the UN as an international body failing, or just there are a lot of outcomes that we'd like to see that they're not necessarily meeting on so many levels. So why do you think, if any of the panelists would like to answer, why do we bother with these conferences? What makes them important?
I'll jump in. Maybe somebody wants to add as well, but it's an excellent question. And I think this is a time throughout our globe where the whole concept of multilateralism is being questioned. But my response to that is, what is the alternative? When we look, for example, at the climate change COPs, the results are never as fast or as profound as what we would like. And yet, if we had not, for example, agreed to the Paris Agreement 10 years ago, the trajectory, it's shown the trajectory of climate temperature rise would have been way higher than it is now. And so while it's never enough, the alternative is a much worse alternative. And so I think the deep disappointment that many of us had at COP29, we perhaps had an even greater fear was that it might have broken down completely and say, we're just going to stop trying. And that didn't happen. Not enough was committed, something was committed. But I think we need to continue trying. I think that's really the message of Pope Francis in his Laudato Deum. People refer to Laudato Deum, which is a shorter encyclical than Laudato Si, as an exclamation point. It's when he calls us to say we must continue to do all we can at a local and personal level, but time is running out. And so we really need to come together as nations and look for global solutions. So it's frustrating, but I think we need to keep at it.
I must admit, I was disappointed while I was there at COP29. With all the, I thought they were just, talking, because I could see the indigenous peoples, the peoples affected, talking about concrete things, and here the negotiators and the officials talking about the money they will give or what they will not give. And so it was disappointing for me. And I said, why did we have to reach 29 COPs to be able to come to this? It's a question. But then I have to say that there was this meeting of is it America All In, where that speaker from the governor of Washington, said that we are all together. We are governors and mayors, Republicans and Democrats, and we are here for the earth, for climate, no? And he said, and we have to be in this. He said, so look at this place where we are all in now. How many people from so many many places, from different walks of life, from different countries, coming together for their one concern for the earth. I think even just for that, maybe it's a good gathering for people to be together for their space, for this space of caring for the earth.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you both. I think you highlight a really, really important point of how powerful collective action is and how we keep coming back to that for the hopeful movements that push us forward in the way that this still does hold people accountable. We had one question come in asking, in spite of the disappointments, what keeps you going? I would maybe add, what gives you hope? What propels you forward in this work?
I think what gives me hope, what gave me hope at COP16 was seeing all the young faces, all the young people who were at the side events, who were also speaking out, who were actively participating. Now, I say young, maybe they weren't that young, but now I'm moving towards the other end of the scale. They did look young for me, and they were marvelous. And one message that they kept saying over and over and over again was, listen to us, because we are the future. And if you don't join us at this moment, we won't have a future. And you who are older have really enjoyed the benefits of biodiversity long before we started to lose it. And I think that that's one thing that has given me hope. The other that has really given me hope is returning to Guatemala and seeing how the young team here that I work with were so interested in what went on at COP16 and biodiversity and constantly asking me, and so what is our government going to be doing, Dee? What's Guatemala going to be doing? And I think the hopefulness there is that wherever we are in the world, we can ask the same questions and look for answers. So that gives me hope, the fact that young people are stepping up. And also what gives me hope is that we're listening to Indigenous people more and more. And the wisdom of Indigenous people in directing us and helping us confront biodiversity loss is something that you cannot put a price on. It's priceless. So that's what I would say. That is what gives me hope.
I want to build on that a little bit, Dee. I came out extremely hopeful, especially from COP16. And one of the reasons was the absolute enthusiasm of the country as a whole. When you arrived in Colombia, it was clear this biodiversity was being taken on by everybody. And that was clear. There's what's called the blue zone, where only people with accreditation can go, and the green zone where anybody can go. And it was organized in Cali, in the center of the city. And tens of thousands, if not, I heard even hundreds of thousands of people attended events. And there was just such a pride, taxi drivers, vendors, everybody, that sense of biodiversity. And so I think Colombia was quite an incredible model of how the society, civil society itself, can really move these issues forward. So in gratitude to them.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing. I think you highlight wonderfully. It's evident that you both show, all three of you show a lot of care, compassion, and commitment in this work, as Dee so eloquently stated. Another question that we had come in is whether population growth is a specific concern affecting climate change. Do any of you feel you can speak a little bit toward that?
That's a good question. I'll admit that it's not one that I've taken into consideration. Yeah, and maybe I'm not really going to answer it directly, but I do want to say that some of the countries in which there's been a tremendous population growth are moving forward and taking some leadership in this whole, especially in the climate change conversation. You know, and in the void of the United States stepping out, some surprising countries such as China is stepping in their incredible innovation towards renewable energy. So it's not really the question of population, but I think there's a space for really countries who have an enormous population really taking leadership, new leadership, I would say, in some of these conferences.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to understand. Returning to Dee, and something you highlighted particularly with the subsidiary body of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and just really highlighting the importance of those voices being heard and being elevated. I'm curious to know your thoughts. What effects could this outcome have on future COP decisions, as well as just on the ground, people's local projects? And if either of the other panelists would like to respond as well.
Thanks, Sarah. I think 50% of the population, the human population in Guatemala, is Indigenous. And all too often, their voices are not being heard. The talk is, oh, that's the old way of thinking, that's the traditional way of thinking. We're now moving into the modern world. And we're hearing all those problems, the modernity and the inability to listen to the land, the inability to bring forward the wisdom of Indigenous peoples into these modern day problems we have. And I think that came through very, very clearly. I was at one presentation of an Indigenous Native American doctor who she gave a presentation. She's based in Canada. And she was very vocal in saying how so many Western educated medical people now are seeking her and her group out to answer some of the pressing medical problems that people in Canada are facing. So I think for me, it's very, very important that the wisdom that the Indigenous communities are not only carrying forward, but are trying to protect also. And I think one of this, as Margaret pointed out, 2,000 land defenders have been murdered. Many, many defenders of the land here in Guatemala have been murdered. And they've been murdered because they do not want the invasion of corporate industry and extractive industries coming in and contaminating what they see as their sacred mother. And I think those are the kind of things we should be listening to.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. One final question for all of our panelists today, maybe in response to this same theme of which voices are heard and which are suffocated in a way. Did you feel that the parties or political leaders heard what civil society is trying to convey in these conferences?
I'll jump in there. There was no way they could not hear. You know, one extraordinary thing that happens at these COPs is that they actually allow a certain amount of protest under a lot of regimentation, but there's so many climate justice activists that are there, and so many colorful, artistic, musical, whatever expressions. And so wherever the negotiators went, that was present before them. And so I congratulate those people who organized in such a creative way. I think they were very clear about what the call was.
I think also for me, the important thing is that everybody's affected by biodiversity loss and climate change. So as you said right at the beginning, Sarah, the intervention of the Guatemalan woman at the end from the floor, giving the final word, not the one up on the pedestal. That's where the future is. And if they choose not to listen, they will be left behind, not the rest of us.
Yeah, thank you all. That is a very powerful note to end on. And thank you to all of our attendees for all of your questions and attentiveness during this session. Special thank you to our presenters once again for sharing your really important takeaways and the wisdom that you've gained with us. At this point, Thomas has a few final announcements for us before we end the session. So over to Thomas.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you all who joined us today. It was a beautiful day out today, so I'm glad you shared your time with us. A little housekeeping, we're sending out an email with the video recordings of this webinar, as well as all the slides that you saw today. And we also have an action alert that went out yesterday that goes to the Senate addressing a permitting reform bill that would make it easier for companies to drill for fossil fuels. So take a look at that, and hopefully you can send a message to your senator. We also invite you to take a look at our website where the webinar, this recording will be hosted, and sign up for our other action alerts, our other resources, and we have a variety of other things, including reflections on scripture. So take a look at our website, see what you can sign up for. And of course, we're on social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Skies recently. So take a look at all of that. And I hope that we will see you all very soon. And thank you again to the presenters. You did a wonderful job.
Thanks, everybody.